I thought it was just a favor. Just helping out at my friend's house like I'd done 100 times before. Then his mom looked at me and said, "Lock the door." Not urgently. Not nervously. Like privacy was something she'd been waiting for. The click of the lock changed the air between us. The room felt warmer. Quieter. She didn't move closer, but somehow, everything else did. And in that silence, I realized, some moments don't cross lines. They reveal them. I'd been in that house so many times that I could move through it without thinking. The loose step near the hallway. The way the living room light always felt softer in the afternoon, like it was filtered through memory instead of glass. It was my friend's place, comfortable, familiar, almost invisible to me by now. Or at least, it used to be. That day felt the same at first. Normal. I kicked off my shoes by the door, the air carrying a quiet mix of brewed tea and clean fabric. Somewhere in the back of the house, a washing machine hummed steadily, like a heartbeat you only notice when you're paying attention. I wasn't paying attention. Not yet. She was in the kitchen when I walked in. My friend's mom had always been kind in that effortless way, never loud, never distant. She carried herself with a calm confidence, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. She smiled when she saw me, not wide or forced, just warm enough to feel genuine. I smiled back, the way I always did. Polite. Easy. Familiar. But something hesitated inside me. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't dramatic. Just a small pause I couldn't explain. Like a sentence stopping mid-thought. She looked present. More than usual. Not dressed differently, not trying to be anything she wasn't. Still graceful, still composed. But her eyes lingered on me just a second longer than I expected, as if she was really seeing me instead of simply recognizing me. We exchanged a few normal words. "How are you? Long day. You hungry?" The kind of conversation that fills space without asking anything of you. Yet even then, I noticed how quiet the house felt around us. No TV. No background noise. Just voices and the soft sounds of the room holding them. When she handed me a glass, our fingers brushed. It was nothing. Accidental. Brief. But I felt it clearly. The warmth. The awareness. I pulled my hand back a little too quickly and told myself I was imagining things. That this was just what happened when you paid too much attention to ordinary moments. Still, I found myself noticing details I never had before. The way she leaned against the counter instead of standing straight. The faint lines near her eyes when she smiled, not hiding age but wearing it comfortably. The steadiness in her movements, like someone who had lived enough to stop rushing. I reminded myself who she was. Who I was. The labels mattered, didn't they? They were supposed to. Yet as I stood there, surrounded by a space that had always felt safe and predictable, I had the strange sense that something had already shifted, quietly, politely, without asking either of us for permission. And I didn't know yet whether that feeling meant danger, or honesty. The request came quietly, almost casually. I was moving toward the kitchen table to set down the glass of water she'd given me, and she stopped me with a soft, almost playful smile. "Could you lock the door?" she asked. It was such a simple sentence. Ordinary, really. Nothing in the tone suggested urgency or fear. But the way she said it made the air feel different. It wasn't commanding. It wasn't teasing. It was intentional. As if locking that door wasn't just about the mechanics of the latch, but about the space between us, about what could happen, or what she allowed herself to feel could happen, when no one else was watching. I hesitated, just for a heartbeat, fumbling slightly with the keys in my pocket. The words echoed in my mind, almost like a question I wasn't meant to answer aloud. "Privacy makes everything feel different," she'd said, lightly, but her eyes held a weight to them, something that wasn't fully explained, something that invited observation. I turned the knob slowly, letting the click of the lock sound louder than it should have. It was as if that one small action had shifted the atmosphere. The hum of the washing machine in the back room seemed farther away. The faint aroma of tea, which had been comforting a moment before, suddenly felt warmer, intimate somehow. The light falling through the kitchen window seemed to linger in corners, tracing the curve of the countertop, the subtle lines of her hands as she rested them there. She watched me. Not in a way that made me uncomfortable, but in a way that made me aware of her awareness. There was a pause after the lock clicked into place, and in that silence, the room felt smaller, heavier with meaning I didn't yet understand. I caught myself noticing everything about her, the way her hair brushed her shoulders, the quiet elegance of her posture, the way her lips pressed together before she spoke. "It just feels different," she said, not looking at me directly but letting her voice float through the room. The sentence was half explanation, half confession. I nodded, not sure what to say. I wanted to tell her it was nothing, that it was just a door, just a normal afternoon, but somehow that felt wrong. Because the truth was, everything already felt different. I moved back toward the kitchen table, but my steps were slower, more measured. Every sound, the click of the chair, the faint squeak of the floorboards, felt sharper, more intimate. My own heartbeat seemed loud in my chest, not from fear, but from awareness. She was letting me in, subtly, quietly, without words. And I was noticing. More than I was supposed to. In that moment, I realized that some requests are never just about the action itself. Sometimes they're about the permission to notice, to feel, to step into a space where normal rules don't fully apply. And even though I tried to keep my voice casual, my thoughts scattered in polite explanations, I knew one thing clearly: locking that door had changed the room. It had changed the way I looked at her. And in ways I couldn't yet name, it had changed me. Once the door was locked, the house felt smaller. Not in a bad way, but in a way that made every sound, every movement, every breath feel more intimate. The usual rhythm of the afternoon, the hum of the washing machine, the faint creak of floorboards, even the ticking of a clock somewhere, felt sharper, closer, like it was part of the conversation rather than background noise. We moved to the living room, and she gestured toward the sofa with that same effortless elegance that always seemed natural. I took a seat across from her, but this time, the distance felt off. Too far. Somehow the space between us no longer fit the rhythm of the day. I shifted slightly, not enough to close the gap fully, but enough to feel the warmth of her presence more keenly. We started talking, casually at first. About the weather, about trivial things. She asked about my week, I asked about hers. But the words had a softness, a pause, a hesitation that wasn't there before. The normal flow of conversation had been replaced by something heavier, more intentional. Every sentence she spoke seemed to linger in the air, and every time our eyes met, it was longer than politeness required. I found myself noticing her in ways I never had. The gentle tilt of her head when she was thinking. The way her fingers brushed the edge of the sofa. The subtle lines around her eyes, the quiet resilience in the curve of her shoulders. She wasn't trying to be noticed, but somehow I couldn't look away. I realized I was listening differently too, not just hearing the words, but absorbing them, storing them, letting them settle. When she laughed softly at something trivial, it wasn't just a sound, it was a warmth that seemed to radiate across the room. And I noticed that when she smiled, it didn't just light her face, it pulled the space around her into that glow. At one point, we were both quiet. I wasn't sure who had stopped talking first. The silence stretched comfortably, but it was charged, like an unspoken understanding had entered the room. I became aware of small movements, her foot tapping lightly against the floor, her hand resting near her lap, the soft brushing of her sleeve against the couch. I caught myself imagining what it would feel like if our space shrank even more, if our knees brushed, if our hands, but I immediately pushed the thought away. I reminded myself who she was. Who I was. And yet, even as I disciplined my thoughts, I couldn't ignore the pull, the subtle gravity that seemed to exist between us now. She looked at me then, directly this time, and I could see something unspoken in her eyes. Not desire, exactly, not yet, but curiosity. Awareness. A hint that she, too, felt the shift, the closeness, the change in rhythm. And in that moment, every polite barrier, every rehearsed reason why nothing could happen, felt thinner than it had a minute ago. We sat there like that for a long while, sharing the same air, the same quiet, the same small, invisible tension. It wasn't dangerous. It wasn't forbidden, not yet. But it was undeniably there. And I realized something quietly terrifying and thrilling. This moment, this closeness, was already rewriting the ordinary day I had walked into. The quiet stretched between us longer than usual that afternoon. Neither of us had moved much since sitting on the sofa. The room felt almost suspended, as if the air itself had grown heavier with attention. I found myself aware of everything: the faint scent of her perfume, soft like vanilla and lavender, the way sunlight fell across her hair, making it shine just slightly lighter at the tips. Even the ticking of the clock on the wall felt amplified, marking the slow passage of a moment that felt impossibly significant. She shifted slightly to reach for her teacup, and our hands brushed, not fully, just fingertips grazing the other. It was brief, almost accidental, but it lingered in a way nothing else had so far. My chest tightened. I pulled my hand back, though only a little, and for a second, I wondered why a simple touch could feel like an invitation and a warning at the same time. I tried to speak, to break the silence, but my voice caught in my throat. She noticed. Her eyes met mine, steady and calm, but carrying something unspoken. A question, maybe. Or a statement she wasn't ready to say aloud. Without thinking, I placed my hand over hers, covering the faint warmth that had lingered when we touched. It was instinctive, not calculated. Neither of us pulled away immediately. We just let it be. Her fingers twitched slightly under mine, almost imperceptibly, and I felt a jolt of something I couldn't name, a mix of trust, tension, and anticipation. My heartbeat echoed in my ears, louder than I expected, yet the room itself remained quiet, peaceful, almost reverent. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She just let our hands rest together for a few seconds, long enough that it felt like a statement in itself. The air seemed to hum softly with meaning, a language beyond words, a connection that neither dared to label. I could feel her warmth, steady and reassuring, as if she was testing boundaries without crossing them. And in that stillness, I realized how fragile and electric moments like these could be. I looked down at our hands, then back up at her face. There was a softness there now, a vulnerability I hadn't noticed before, carefully hidden behind her usual composed demeanor. And I understood, in that quiet, perfect tension, that this touch was not just a touch, it was permission, trust, and acknowledgement rolled into one delicate moment. Finally, we let go, carefully, slowly, almost reluctantly. But the effect lingered. The air didn't change immediately, but something between us had. It was a shift that couldn't be unseen, a quiet acknowledgement that the dynamic between us was no longer the same. Every glance, every pause, every half-smile afterward carried the memory of that touch, a silent rhythm that threaded through the rest of the conversation. And in that moment, I knew, the ordinary afternoon I had expected was gone. Something new, something unspoken, had begun to unfold. The first meaningful touch had passed, but its presence remained, settling between us like a secret we both understood without having to speak it. After that brief touch, the room felt different, lighter and heavier at the same time. We had moved back into conversation, but it was slower now, careful. Every word seemed to carry more weight than before, as if silence had become a language we both understood. I could feel her presence keenly, like the air between us had grown thicker, charged, yet not in a way that was overwhelming, just alive, attentive, and intimate. She leaned back slightly on the sofa, but not fully relaxed. Her eyes were fixed on me, steady, calm, but curious, searching. "I don't usually talk about this," she said softly, her voice carrying a note of hesitation. "About how it feels to be noticed in a way that matters." She glanced down for a moment, then back up, meeting my eyes as if she were testing me, asking me silently if I would listen without judgment. I swallowed, realizing I was holding my breath. I nodded. "I'm listening," I said, the words simple, but honest. And then she did something unexpected. She didn't move closer, but she didn't retreat either. She stayed in that space between us, allowing the unspoken tension to settle without forcing it. Her hands rested lightly in her lap, but I noticed the small movements, how her fingers flexed, how she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Every gesture felt like a punctuation mark in the conversation we were no longer having aloud. I don't know if it's appropriate, she continued, her voice a little quieter now. I've been living with so many roles, so many expectations. And sometimes, it's exhausting. And sometimes, you just want to be seen, really seen, without pretense or caution. Her words hit me in a way that made the room feel even smaller. It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't teasing. It was honesty. Vulnerability. And it made the air between us feel almost sacred. I realized that for the first time, she wasn't wearing the armor of composure, she was allowing herself to be human, and she was trusting me enough to do it. I shifted slightly, my hands resting naturally on my knees, trying to match her openness. I get that, I said softly. I don't always know what to do with it, but I notice. I notice you. And I respect it. My words sounded simple, but they weren't rehearsed. They were my truth, and I hoped she felt it. Her lips curved into a faint smile, small but sincere. There was a pause then, heavy and full. We didn't need more words. Just the recognition that had passed between us, that shared understanding of honesty, trust, and quiet longing. It was a moment of intimacy unlike any I had experienced before, the kind that lingered in the chest long after the sound of her voice faded. And I realized, with a quiet thrill and careful restraint, that something important had shifted. The first meaningful touch had opened the door, but her words had walked through it. Now we were in a space where truth and emotion could exist without fear, where closeness wasn't just physical but profoundly human. And in that space, I understood, this connection was real, fragile, and utterly undeniable. After that conversation, the air between us had changed entirely. There was no need for words anymore, every movement, every glance, seemed weighted with intention and understanding. The room felt warmer, the afternoon light softer, as if the house itself had shifted to match the pace of our thoughts. I was acutely aware of her presence, of how the space we shared suddenly felt intimate without us doing anything overt to make it so. She moved slightly on the sofa, closer than before, not touching me, not leaning, just shifting in a way that reduced the invisible distance. I noticed it immediately. My chest tightened, but I stayed still, letting the moment settle. The subtle gravity between us was undeniable. It wasn't about desire yet, not exactly, it was about trust, vulnerability, and the quiet acknowledgement that we were both aware of something that had never existed between us before. Her hands rested lightly on her lap, but the way her fingers curled, unconsciously seeking comfort or grounding, made me want to reach out, not in a forward or bold way, but in a gentle, protective gesture. I did, instinctively, letting my shoulder brush lightly against hers. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the contact shifted the room again. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She simply leaned into it, a little, just enough for the closeness to feel mutual. The silence was heavy, but not awkward. It was alive, full of tension, understanding, and something unspoken that needed no explanation. I could feel her breathing, steady and calm, yet somehow synchronized with mine. Every glance she gave me, every fraction of a smile that touched her eyes, made it clear she knew exactly what was happening without having to speak it aloud. We stayed like that for a long moment, suspended in the quiet intimacy of a room that had become our own small world. I realized then that restraint could be as powerful as action. That the decision not to cross lines, at least not yet, made every small gesture, every subtle touch, every shared breath feel exponentially more meaningful. Finally, she leaned her head just slightly against my shoulder. Not a lean that demanded anything from me, not a gesture that forced a choice. Just a soft, fleeting rest, a quiet surrender to the trust we had built in the past hour. I felt the warmth of her presence, steady and calm, and the weight of it settled in my chest in a way that was thrilling and grounding all at once. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just let the moment exist. In that small, fragile space, I understood the depth of what had shifted. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a declaration. It was the realization that we could share closeness, warmth, and vulnerability without needing to define it. That in itself was its own kind of intimacy, more profound than words or actions could ever convey. And as the minutes passed in silence, I knew we had reached a peak, not of passion, but of emotional connection. The room, the locked door, the warmth, the quiet, they were all witnesses to a subtle, undeniable truth. Something rare and delicate had begun, something neither of us could ignore, and something we both understood would change everything from this moment forward. The afternoon had quietly shifted into evening. The golden light outside softened, spilling through the curtains and painting the room in warm amber. Everything outside the locked door felt distant now, as if the house itself existed solely for us for this brief, suspended moment. Yet somehow, the intensity of the day didn't feel heavy, it felt meaningful, like a secret shared without words. She stood, stretching slightly, the fluid grace of her movements drawing my attention even though I knew I shouldn't let it. I stood too, feeling the pull of unspoken understanding between us. We both knew what had happened, the closeness, the trust, the subtle warmth of shared vulnerability, and yet there was no rush to label it, no need to force a definition onto something delicate and fragile. I guess, she said softly, letting her voice trail off, the world is waiting outside. Her eyes held that same calm intensity, that quiet awareness of everything that had passed between us. I nodded, understanding perfectly. The room had given us a space to notice each other, to connect, to feel, and now it was time to step back into reality. I walked to the door and unlocked it slowly, the click echoing softly. It felt symbolic, almost ceremonial. The moment we had created inside the room stayed with us, but now we were acknowledging the world beyond it. She followed me with her eyes, her expression warm but restrained, a faint smile brushing her lips. It was the kind of smile that carried gratitude, trust, and a hint of wonder all at once. Before leaving, she gave a small gesture, subtle but meaningful. Her hand brushed against mine as she reached for something on the counter. It wasn't bold. It wasn't forward. It was simply a touch, a quiet acknowledgement that what had passed between us mattered, that it had shifted something fundamental in both of us. I didn't pull away, letting it linger just long enough to feel the connection fully, then released it gently. We exchanged a few ordinary words, about the evening, about plans, about trivial things, and yet every sentence was weighted by the awareness that the ordinary had changed. The smiles lingered a little longer, the glances held a little deeper. It was impossible to ignore the intimacy we had shared, the subtle gravity that had formed between us. And neither of us needed to speak it aloud to understand. As I stepped outside into the soft glow of the evening, I felt the warmth of the house behind me, the echo of her presence lingering in my chest. I knew we had crossed a threshold, not into romance, not fully, but into a space of trust, respect, and quiet affection that neither of us could unsee. The day had been a revelation, a moment of clarity that would stay with me long after the door had been unlocked. And as I walked away, I realized the truth. Some connections don't need a label to matter. Some moments don't need a promise to exist. What we had shared, the quiet closeness, the vulnerability, the subtle touch and understanding, was enough. It had changed us, in ways we didn't need to name, but that neither of us would forget. The door was open again, the world waiting, but the space between us had been sealed, not by rules, but by trust, attention, and something quietly extraordinary. If you enjoyed this slow burn romance, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories exploring emotional intimacy, subtle tension, and heartfelt connections. Don't forget to hit the bell icon to catch new videos first.